Good morning. I'm Michael Peterson, President and CEO of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the inaugural session of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation Economic Forum. And this forum will bring together thought leaders from around the country, helping shaping the future of our nation for in-depth conversations about America's most important and pressing policy issues. As many of you know, we usually hold our fiscal summit every time this spring. And unfortunately, we could not hold it in a live in-person event due to the pandemic, but we think it's critical to continue these conversations, and it's even more important given the pressing matters that are going on today. So thank you for joining us for this first session. Our initial series in the forum is called Restoring Our Economy Post-Pandemic. And this series will focus on the significant impact and policy implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, exploring lessons learned thus far, ideas for safely reopening the economy, and how effective fiscal policy can both aid the recovery and prepare us better in the future for the next crisis. We're very pleased today to welcome Phill Swagel, the Director of the Congressional Budget Office. Phill is just the 10th director in CBO history, and he's well prepared for this moment with his deep experience as an economist, an academic, and it's especially his work at the Treasury Department following the financial crisis in the late 2000s. So we're thrilled to have him today. Just a reminder, we're happy to include your questions in this conversation. Please submit them by clicking on the circle at the bottom of your screen that reads Q&A. Click on that and type it, and that will be funneled up to us to ask Phill. We're going to have 2 additional sessions in the series that will be announced soon, so keep an eye on that. So Phill, we're thrilled to have you join us as our first guest. So let's bring on Phill. Good morning. Great to see you.
Hi, Michael. Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for having me on.
So as we all know, this is a critical and very painful period in our nation's history. We're in the midst of a pandemic that has killed more than 100,000 of our fellow citizens. The crisis has left millions out of work, devastating many businesses and parts of the economy. And at the same time, there's growing painful divisions due to the endemic issues of racial injustice that persist in our society. This crisis has affected those communities deeply. Firstly, with the disproportionate health effects of the COVID-19 disease. Secondly, by the disproportionate effect on them economically, on these communities. And third, as you probably know and have seen, many of these minorities are less able to obtain some of those forms of relief that have been provided. So they're hit in multiple ways by this crisis. And we feel it's incumbent on all of us in the policy community to acknowledge these issues and confront them and figure out how to address them. So there's a lot to discuss. So let's dive into some of these issues. So in terms of your role at CBO and CBO's role itself, you've been there for a year now. I'm sure you never contemplated serving in that capacity during a situation like this. And just to start off, generally speaking, how do you see CBO's role? What can CBO do to help the country through this crisis? And how can CBO help confront some of these very important challenges that affect race and our communities and the disparities that we're seeing now?
Yeah, it's certainly an unusual time, and you see behind me, I'm at home and I'm in the dining room of our house. So CBO's role is to support the Congress. So we provide analysis, and what I've told members of Congress is that if I'm successful, they won't know what I think about any bill. They'll get our analysis and not our opinion. So we provide analysis both as they formulate policy, technical assistance, and then once legislation is ready and voted upon, we provide a cost estimate. But we don't just have fiscal blinders on. We are well aware of the nature of this pandemic and the important distinctions of it that you mentioned, the disproportionate effect at the bottom of the income distribution, and especially the most vulnerable in our society and racial minorities who are hit especially hard. And so CBO's done a lot of work on distribution. We're continuing to do that. We're looking during this pandemic at the effects of the economic meltdown on people at the bottom of the distribution by location, by race, by other aspects, so that policymakers have a sense of what's happening in the economy and also what the effects of legislative proposals are.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's talk about where the economy's headed. I want to speak to you about the jobs report and get your views on that. But before we dive into that, Recently, CBO published its new updated economic forecast through 2030. Obviously, it's a difficult time to predict what's going to go on, given the unique nature of this pandemic and the economic fallout. And there's been a lot of talk and varying opinions about the shape of the recovery and how quickly and how long it'll take. Tell us a little bit about how you arrived at your forecast, what you think are the key drivers of that, what the key takeaways the public should come away with from it, and how you see the next 10 years.
It's an especially challenging time to look ahead at the economy because so much depends on the nature of the pandemic and the progress with scientific efforts aimed at whether treatment or vaccine. So we have a virus team set up within CBO looking at these issues. And we have, in some sense, a parameter for social distancing, which peaked a month or two ago. And obviously social distancing has fallen off rapidly within the last week. And that extent of social distancing affects both businesses and consumer spending. So we are, in some sense, interacting our economic views with our the evidence we gather from science to look at the economy. And that has shaped our projection over the next year or two. A real challenge is that we have to look out 10 years ahead to best support the Congress. And the challenges in understanding what the pandemic means for productivity and for the long run nature of our labor market and our economy. We're looking at that carefully. We will have another economic update later this summer, and that will build in our best thinking about these longer term impacts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, just specifically, there's a lot of variation among states, as we've all seen in their reaction. As you said, the date of a vaccine has a huge impact. How did you confront some of those particulars on this crisis?
Yeah, so of course, we're economists and policy analysts. We're well aware that most of us are not epidemiologists. We happen to have a few staff members with some superb training in epidemiology, and they've been important in our analysis. But basically, we reached out to experts, both in the U.S. government, in academia, in private sector, in the U.S. and around the world. And people have been willing to help us, including running variants of their models for us. So we've tried to gather a range of evidence and then say our projections will be based on what we think is the center of the distribution. So it could be worse, it could be better. We all hope it's better, but that our projection is something based on the middle of the range of possibilities.
Okay. Let's talk about the jobs report. So last Friday, the labor report came out showing that the economy added 2.5 million jobs in May and the unemployment rate falling to 13.3%. What was your reaction to this report? Is this an indication that legislation has been effective? Does the lower than expected rate of unemployment change your projections and views? And how do you see this report and its relevance?
Yeah, it's certainly an important indicator for policymakers. It was better, as you said, than market participants expected. And the rebound seems to have begun. On the other hand, the unemployment rate remains very high, and the GDP remains considerably below the level it was before the pandemic took hold, let alone below the level that we expected in our forecast made before the pandemic. So in some sense, that's the challenge for policymakers, is to think about both the level where we are relative to full employment and the growth rate, the what seems to be a positive trajectory. We are looking carefully to see those signs of what are consumers doing, what are businesses doing as the economy reopens. And as you said, it varies by location, right? Places that depended on personal contact have been much more affected than others in industries and so on. And so we're looking carefully to see how the economy changes and evolves as the reopening continues. The experience of recent downturns has been that the recovery is prolonged. And so that's why in our latest economic projections, we have it taking years for us to get back to the level of GDP where we were before the pandemic.
Yeah, it takes, I think, about 10 years to get back to that level. So I mean, there's a lot happening month by month. This summer is going to bring a whole range of new data on this. Do the next several months matter a lot in terms of the 10-year outlook, or is it a slow, gradual recovery anyway? Like how influential are these months in terms of your economic model and 10-year thinking?
Yeah, it's crucial on both the economic side and the science side. So our projections so far allow for the possibility of a resurgence of the virus. And especially we saw that as a seasonal, the possibility of a seasonal impact with the virus coming back in December, January, February, and that affecting both consumer spending, business investment. Of course, with the sudden and I think unexpected end of social distancing in many places, it could be we see a resurgence. It's something that we're looking at carefully, and again thinking about what that does to consumer spending and business investment. The other thing that we're looking at carefully is what happens with healthcare spending. That, of course, we understand there's lots of spending related to the COVID virus, but there's other care that was delayed, and we're watching to see how much of that comes back, how quickly, and then this is whether the procedures that weren't done this year, if we see them showing up in the data next year.
Yeah, that's a huge factor for that sector, most certainly. Let's talk about the response and the enormous amount of legislation that's taken place. I know that's something the Congress relies on CBO heavily for. The federal government's committed $2.4 trillion to fighting the virus and supporting the economy. Which within that legislation, which policies have you found to be particularly effective and strategic interventions? And looking forward, what additional policies do you think are going to be necessary, and where can we get the most bang for the buck in this absolutely critical policy response?
Yeah, it's remarkable how much has been done already, and the Congress acted quickly, and the agencies implementing these programs also acted quickly and effectively. So I just want to name a couple of things that have happened. The Treasury Department and the IRS processed tax rebates, so sending out checks and deposits and debit cards incredibly quickly. This was done when I was at the Treasury Department in 2008. It was done faster this time around. So I think that the IRS and those other agencies deserve a lot of credit. The Small Business Administration and the Treasury together put together the Paycheck Protection Program, and again, pushing out a huge amount of money relatively quickly. And then, of course, the Federal Reserve has also undertaken a huge range of important steps. There's been additional support to the economy through the unemployment insurance system, both an increase in benefits and also an expansion of the aperture of coverage in a sense, and more people in part-time employment and in the gig economy having access to this support. So the effectiveness you had asked about, we look at the effectiveness of these programs in the 2008 and 2009 recession as giving us important evidence on the bang for the buck in a sense. Many of the programs were aimed at the bottom half of the income distribution, right? The tax rebate checks had income phase outs. Unemployment insurance, of course, goes to people who are unemployed, who tend to have low incomes, and so on. The Paycheck Protection Program, was aimed at businesses keeping employees on the payroll up to a certain amount of annual salary. So all of these things are aimed at the bottom of the distribution. Of course, the Fed programs have a wider coverage. And we see that as relatively effective in supporting demand. By far not preventing a plunge in activity in a weak economy, but the actions taken so far have certainly offset some of the downturn.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a couple of questions on this from members of the audience. So Mark Zashin asks, how long do you feel stimulus should be available to companies and individuals and eventually going to states and cities? And also Tori Gorman asks, would Phill elaborate on how extending the $600 a week pandemic unemployment insurance would lead to both lower GDP and lower employment in 2021? So specifically, how do you feel about those measures and the duration?
Okay, no, thank you, and thanks for the questions, and it's good to hear from Tori. Let me take those in turn. So, of course, the CBO doesn't put forward our opinion on policies. So we talk about the effects and not whether it's a good or bad thing. And sometimes that can actually lead to, it's not confusion, but it's a natural question. The CBO is here. We tell members what something costs, but it's up to policymakers to decide whether the cost is worth it. And so that it's just a natural challenge of the job. So there's, of course, we understand there's a discussion now of potential aid, additional aid to state and local governments. State and local governments got aid already in the 4 COVID-related legislative packages that have been enacted. The evidence of 2008 and 2009 suggests that aid prevented tax hikes and spending cuts that state and local governments would have otherwise done. They did some employment of teachers and other state and local employees went down in the last crisis, but the aid prevented it from being worse. So we see that as having an impact, and it's something that we've talked about recently. I sent a letter to Senate Minority Leader Schumer and Senator Sanders, who's the ranking member of the Budget Committee, that talked about the impact of those steps. On the unemployment insurance side, the second question is, again, it's something we're looking at carefully, and we're certainly aware that it's something that policymakers are thinking about, where there's an increase in the generosity of unemployment insurance benefits, and an additional $600 per week for a temporary period. And policymakers are looking to see how should that continue. There's been proposals for unemployment insurance to be linked to economic conditions, whether nationally or by state. And the question alluded to the difficulty of this. The trade-off between additional unemployment insurance benefits supporting demand, and people have higher incomes, so their spending on everything is higher than it would be if they didn't have the income. On the other hand, many workers with the additional $600 benefits will have higher incomes while unemployed than they would be in the jobs that they're likely to get if they go back into the labor force. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, the first effects surely dominated, right? The economy is locked down. The labor market was not, people were not hiring, the opposite. But as the economy reopens, we're going to see a natural tension between these two effects. And I recently sent a letter to Senator Grassley, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, that talked about these tensions, and that's on the CBO website. And again, policymakers have to balance these different effects. We're here to support them, provide the analysis.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This crisis has highlighted the whole issue of preparedness, not only on the next viral pandemic, but on climate and food safety, our infrastructure, and of course, our unsustainable fiscal outlook. So I guess, how does CBO look at these risks as it does its forecasts and its thinking about policymaking? And what ways do you think policymakers should better prepare for future crises of various sorts?
Yeah. From the economic side, we start by acknowledging that there's just tremendous uncertainty in our outlook. Is what do we worry about going forward? Let me talk about the fiscal first, just because that's the natural place for CBO, for the CBO to start. Mm-hmm. The fiscal response, of course, is natural and expected, and that's part of the U.S. policy response to economic downturns. The challenge, of course, is that it raises our debt level and means the fiscal situation was already difficult and now becomes yet more difficult. On the other hand, of course, interest rates remain low, both because of market participants' beliefs and because of actions taken by the Federal Reserve to support the economy through expansionary monetary policy. So the fiscal steps taken so far have not greatly increased the burden on the Treasury of funding our debt. If anything, lower rates have made it still relatively easy for the Treasury to fund itself. The challenge is that there's no guarantee that will persist over time. And the higher debt level makes the US economy more vulnerable if there's a change in interest rates, whether because of something happening here in the U.S. or because of a change in global investor sentiment or economic conditions. And that's the challenge for policymakers, is to take the steps today that are needed to support the economy while looking ahead and understanding that over time as a nation, we have to address the fiscal challenge. The challenge has gotten more difficult as a result of the steps that have been taken to address the pandemic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the longer term fiscal projection and the impact of this crisis on it, right? Obviously, before we entered this situation, deficits were high and growing. There were a lot of structural factors. In terms of your much longer projections, how do you see this crisis affecting those trends? Do we have all the same problems all over again after all this, or are there some interactions between the two that change the outlook, better or worse? But most likely worse, I would obviously guess.
Most likely worse. Yeah, that I think you've put your finger on the challenge, is that the interactions between the economic changes and the social changes, where you started the conversation about the unequal impacts of the pandemic across our society, that the suffering of the nation is not felt unequally. To paraphrase President Bush in a video message that he put out. And we know that the needs of society will be higher as many people see them, and we see this on healthcare, on the distributional issues with income as well. And then we have to think about what's the long-term effect of the pandemic on productivity growth, and sometimes on the productive capacity of our nation. Will we return to the reasonably strong growth that we had before the pandemic? And one thing that was noteworthy before the pandemic was that the long expansion had meant that wages and incomes were rising reasonably strongly at the bottom of the distribution. So people who hadn't felt the initial rising prosperity of the nation during the recovery, before the pandemic, they were feeling that rising prosperity. It doesn't mean that everything was perfect in the U.S. Before the pandemic, but that was a success. That the bottom of the distribution was feeling gains, and the question is, will it take another decade of an upswing? If we can experience that before the economy addresses those needs, and it's an economic challenge. It's a social one. That policymakers, of course, are thinking hard about.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting to see this moment in history. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, you helped shape and live through the financial crisis of 2008. They're very different, but there's a lot of similarities too. Can you compare and contrast the two crises and kind of how they may impact the economy over the long term?
Yeah, in some ways, the policy response now is more difficult. It sure felt difficult in 2008 when I was at the Treasury Department, but there's a sense in which the policy response worked through, generally through the banking system, which is heavily regulated. Again, it's not a pejorative or a praise. It's just that the federal regulators had to tap into the levers that were needed to stabilize the economy and through the TARP and others. In this case, it's more difficult, right? There's a scientific dimension where the federal government, of course, plays an important role, but there's no magic wand over which we can make scientific progress. And we're all watching that and hoping for the best. And then the challenge then is deciding how to support the economy through what programs. And it's noteworthy, again, the range of mechanisms that have been used. Right? I mentioned the rebate checks, expanded UI, state and local government. There's been support for healthcare. There's a range of business taxes that have been provisions put in place to provide liquidity to businesses. A huge range of efforts so far. The Paycheck Protection Program. And in some sense, it's just more challenging for policymakers just to support the economy, given the depth and breadth of this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. I guess as you look at the trends going on and the complexity that you're mentioning and the difficulty, are you seeing things going on in the economy that will change the way you forecast and what you forecast? I think we're all experiencing a lot of Zoom. There's a lot of other trends that may emerge. Healthcare, telemedicine is being, rapidly advanced. You probably haven't had time to collect your thoughts on all that, but as one of the leaders of long-term thinking and long-term forecasting, what are you seeing out there that interests you that you think might yield to different levels of productivity in the future and some of these systemic changes that might be for the better, actually?
Yeah, it's something we're looking at carefully. And as you said, the CBO has an important role to play in analyzing the long term. We have an expert group that looks at potential output, the long-run productive capacity of the nation. And so we're looking at, as you said, what happens with information technology. And so this is the ability of to do sessions such as this, where the CBO has been working virtually with staff, nearly all staff working from home over these past few months. And it's difficult, right? It's especially difficult on staff with young children, or really children of any age, or taking care of parents and others, or people who are vulnerable. But it's been working. And I think that's the case for many businesses. So that's certainly a positive in a difficult situation. That's one thing. I'm thinking of a longer term. Of course, I mentioned the healthcare. We're looking at what happens there, and then of course we're looking at the nature of the labor market after the pandemic ends, and we're going to be looking carefully at that as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last question, just about healthcare. That's 20% of our economy, has been growing faster than the economy for a long time, which represents key fiscal challenges, has huge impacts to the economy. Specifically COVID-19 and how it's impacting the health sector. The delay in surgeries has led to a lot of financial difficulty at hospitals and so forth. Just talk a little bit about that sector and the specific impact this is having and some of the concerns or issues you're grappling with as you forecast.
Yeah, it's something we've been looking at, both the impacts of the pandemic and the longer term changes happening within the healthcare sector. And CBO has an incredible healthcare group, and we've had work on a range of issues, expanding healthcare coverage. We've looked at a variety of things, a single payer, we're looking at public option, we're looking at ways to expand insurance company through incremental changes, say changes to the subsidies in the Affordable Care Act. We're looking at HSAs and other individually focused ways of expanding health coverage. We have a lot of work on pharmaceutical issues, drug prices. We have a report on prevention that we're working on. And then, of course, now the virus and the long-term impacts on of the pandemic. And we know that this will come to the fore in policymakers' minds. And again, the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic on people at the bottom of the income distribution, it's meant that many people have lost health insurance, whether through their employer or insurance that they're buying on their own, perhaps through the marketplaces established by the Affordable Care Act. Some of that will be picked up in Medicaid, and we expect increased enrollment in Medicaid, but it could be that others are uninsured, and it's something that we're looking at carefully. How does that affect people's health, which is ultimately what matters, but also how does it affect the federal budget, and what does that mean for our society? Mm-hmm. So there's a huge range of issues on healthcare, and we're going to be looking at that over the next period ahead.
Terrific. Well, we want to make sure we end on time today. Phill, I just want to say thank you, certainly for participating today, but more importantly for all the work you're doing at CBO. This is an incredibly challenging, important, and difficult time for the country. And having good analysis and having people like you in charge of making sure Congress is well informed and with adequate research and good forecasting is absolutely critical to the policy response, which is so important right now. So thanks for all you and your team are doing in this difficult environment. And we appreciate all your support of our Congress. And we look forward to hearing more from you and your organization in the months and years to come. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks so much.
And thank you all for joining us. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us in our inaugural event. And stay tuned for information about the next series of events coming up in the next few weeks. Thank you very much for joining us.